quick introduction to myself. I am Anish. I am based out of Bombay, India. I run something called the Pink List, which is an archive of politicians supporting queer rights back home. I go by he, him pronouns, and I am very excited to be with all of you here today. And to begin with, I want to say that this has been one of the most different Pride months that I think most of us have celebrated. It's been one that has been defined by a lot of conversations around healthcare, around Black Lives Matter, around access to social justice, around, in India, illegal detentions of political activists. And it's been a particularly charged Pride where, as a community, we've discovered ways in which we have to form solidarities and build movements that truly stand up for equal rights across the board. And I think it's been an interesting Pride also because we've had spaces taken away from us. Many of us have to be at home with unsupportive parents or other family members or families of birth that may not be supportive. There's also been an increase in things like domestic violence and other forms of physical and mental abuse against queer persons. And so this Pride feels different. And the prides that come after will also possibly look very different because it's also been a time when we've been able to discover the incredible work being done by so many other queer people who we simply wouldn't have come to know of if we hadn't been so glued to the internet throughout this month. So I want to start off with a conversation about, the Pride month is over, all the glitter is done, brands are not going to be messaging us anymore about any collaborations. The rainbow logos are off. What has your reflection been on the month that has gone by, and how have you worked through all the conversations that have been happening all around? So I want to start with Linz. Do you want to go ahead, Linz?
Yeah, sure. I can start. I think that something I've been thinking a lot about is figuring out how to decenter my whiteness. As someone who is working in social justice spaces, who's in front of kids a lot, and there not also being like a lot of people who do the work that I do. My primary work is in LGBT education and social justice work for young elementary, primary school age kids. And there's just generally not a lot of work in that space on kind of like a mass level. And kind of being that person and being a white person in that is something I'm kind of trying to figure out of the necessity of the work itself, but trying to figure out where my voice makes sense and who I can uplift and how I can be supportive to, the Black, trans, and queer folks who started our movement. And I think a lot of this has been going back to our roots. I mean, I'm a native New Yorker, and watching the protests in front of Stonewall this past week have been just heartbreaking and incredible and so inspiring. And I wish I could have been there. But it's been a tough month of figuring out how different voices can contribute in the different lanes that we all take, and just kind of trying to back up when we can. That's been my discovery and journey over the last month or so.
Uh-huh. And I actually want to switch up to Leah, because Leah, you've worked a lot on the internet and you have done pathbreaking work around the internet at a time when all of us are on the internet right now, and you've led the campaign against revenge porn. What has that experience been like? What is this overburdening presence of having to negotiate everything on the internet like, if you want to switch off but can't?
Yeah, that's definitely challenging. And to reiterate what my colleague just said, I think the exact same thing. This year, Pride is a protest march in the United States. It's centering Black and brown folks, Black and brown trans folks, queer folks, sex workers, anyone who's been oppressed and marginalized by our systems that are clearly not working for those who are stigmatized because of their identities. And so we as white folks, as white, queer, trans, non-binary folks, are now figuring out how to center our fellow advocates who may look different than us, may be the same as us, in those dialogues without taking up too much space. And I think that I've tried to do that as well in my work combating revenge porn. I hold protest marches nationally and internationally to fight against revenge porn or cybersexual violence against specifically the LGBTQ plus community. And because of, everything that's happening with COVID and, the global pandemic, we're not able to actually take to the streets. So we're taking to the streets digitally. So to answer your question, we are showing up for issues that matter. We are willing to perhaps compromise our health to show up and be on the right side of history, because not showing up for folks that need us most, whether that be victims of revenge porn, whether that be Black and brown folks who are victimized by police brutality and other injustices in our society, we do need to show up, and we do need to put our bodies at risk, because we have so much immense privilege, and not doing that is, again, standing on the wrong side of history. So I try to do that through my activism, and obviously we are advocating digitally as well, but I think that there's nothing more powerful than putting your body out there on the line physically at a protest march or a rally or something like that, showing up physically for people when we need it most.
And I actually want to go to Rachel. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Leah.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
No, I think that definitely does. And I actually want to move on to Rachel right after. And Rachel, you're British born and raised. You're now in Brussels. We're seeing a sort of global sense of solidarity, but in each of our spaces, we're at different places in the conversation. And I think the conversation around intersectionality is sort of at a particular place in the United States, but it's not really reached that in many other parts of the world. So how has that been, navigating different identities when a lot of queer communities also in many parts of the world regard these as not queer issues?
I'm not really sure, but I'm going to give you an answer whether you like it or not. So intersectionality is basically become one of those buzzwords. Like, I don't know what's going on in the US regarding intersectionality, but I think Europe has latched on to intersectionality as another buzzword, as something they can add on to, inclusion, diversity. It's something that we're hearing a lot in these LGBTQI or human rights conferences. And for me, it's kind of, it's disheartening, but it was also predictable. So we knew that this was going to happen. I think a lot of the discussion, like what usually happens, is that we're seeing a lot of people still having the discussion on what actually intersectionality is, and the way whiteness is trying to reappropriate intersectionality as to something that they can claim. And that's why I feel for us as a LGBTQI organization, we're trying to actually educate people and let them know what intersectionality is and how they can use it and appropriate it, not appropriate it, but use it as a tool in order to make sure that the minorities within our minority are seen and heard. So for me, regarding intersectionality, I always ask them, but what is your understanding of intersectionality, and where did you get this definition from? Because if there's no aspect of race in there, then you're not speaking about intersectionality, and every single context is different. And I understand that everybody's hearing about this word. There are people that are practicing intersectionality without even realizing that they're practicing intersectionality. As our language is adapting and growing, we're finding new terms in order to define ourselves and our community, which is giving people a lot of liberation and a lot of space to move. But it's also up to our own communities to also wanting to give people the space to move. I mean, when we speak about the LGBTQI community, it's not just one community. It's a plethora of communities, and each of these communities have a level of communication flowing between them? Is there understanding flowing between them? Is there a holistic approach to everything that we're talking about? More often than not, there isn't one. I think this is a very marking time as we're talking more about trans people, we're talking more about people with a disability, and we're also not only talking about these people, but giving them space, also giving them the mic, which is the most important thing. But on top of that, we're adding a deeper context, a deeper understanding of that. So we're not just talking about people with living with a disability or people who are trans or sex workers. We're talking about the minorities within those minorities. So it'll be people who, you know, who occupy all of those identities at the same time, whilst also being of a different race, and understanding what that actually is. And that intersectionality is not just an add-on of all these discriminations. It's, you know, it's a new type of thing that's formed, and it's something that we need to, find solutions that adapt really well to that particular person's situation. So in Europe, I'd say when we're talking about intersectionality, we're still trying to find ways in order to educate, but also just trying to find new ways to adapt, because Europe is extremely large. So when we speak about Europe, you know, you've got French-speaking countries, you've got Dutch-speaking countries, you've got German-speaking countries, and each one of these contexts are extremely different. From the east, you know, to the west of Europe is extremely different. We look at Scandinavia, and then we look at Italy or Greece. Extremely different contexts, and especially if you're a person of color or if you're a Black person, then of course it's going to differ largely. But there's also going to be some points of that still are comparable to other nations. So like we know when it comes to Black people, especially here in Belgium, Black women, they're the most educated but earn the least. Which is a term that we can see across a number of Western countries. We know that, if we already know that Black women, you know, they're mostly and highly educated, they earn the least. And so if you then go and think about it, you add on a lens of being LGBTQI, you add on a lens of being a sex worker, you add on the lens of being of living with a handicap, then we know that their particular situation is quite dire. So yeah, intersectionality, I think it's making people understand that they need to make sure that everybody can embrace the fullness of their identities as well.
Thank you so much for that. And finally, I want to go to Alex, who, again, as I said, I know from before. And Alex is interesting, right? Alex, your case is very interesting for me because both as Alex and as Maya, you are incredibly outspoken. And that's not something that comes easy, especially when you are in a space where you are performing. And especially when you're in a space that involves commercial organizations. Can you tell me a little more about, one, what it's been like this past month? Because I know a lot of drag queens and drag kings and the drag community at large has been very innovative in India and across the world in coming up with incredible digital spaces. So I want to know a little bit more about that process. And I also want to know your larger journey of being an advocate for queer rights and speaking up against different forms of oppression, caste, religion, and other forms in India, while simultaneously being a performer and being gorgeous and being spectacular.
So, like, if you know where I'm coming from Kerala, and I am born in a conservative Christian family. Now, the pride being intersectional, I'm literally the example for it. Because of me being a South Indian, me being queer, me coming from a background where people don't easily accept people who are openly queer and also who's performing as a drag queen. It was really a journey for me to learn myself, because you know, nobody comes and teaches you that what is your pride history, what was pride all about. All of that I had to learn, like, you know, one by one. Like, people were teaching me, I had to listen, because there are times when we just keep talking, and we just keep saying everything, but there is no you need to learn something. So ultimately, what happened was, for me, even though I come from a privileged organization, that is Lalit Group of Hotels, I had to find a way to create a space where all queer artists and performers are included. there are times when I still have fights with people where I'm saying, I'm trying to make it very inclusive, but the club has its restrictions. Now, during this whole month, what I realized is the companies or the brands that were reaching out to me, it was more of tokenism. They didn't know what is the journey about the Indian struggles. There was this whole bit of, I felt trans women were being eliminated, like their journeys were being eliminated, and it was more of a privilege of a cis gay man being propagated. I felt like there was no point of doing campaigns and doing more of, are you telling stories about queer people? Are you trying to tackle homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia? There was this whole bit of, I felt it was a noise, and it happened all in a month. But then ultimately, I felt like there should have been a way for everyone to learn more about the community. It's not just about changing a logo into rainbow and just happy, creating feel-good music videos and just putting out there saying that we are happy. We are not happy. Trans women are struggling during lockdown. There is people from the community stuck with homophobic families. So we have a lot of work to do. And what I saw was in the internet, there is a rise of homophobia and transphobia. So this is what has been happening for a month or before that as well. But ultimately, what we need to have is a conversation around the community, educating people about the community, which is missing at the moment. Like, people are not educating, saying that, okay, we are human beings, we exist, and this is our identities, and that is something which has been missing. The conversation has not even started. Like, I was honestly asking companies, like, are you trying to do any form of like change in your organization? Are you creating an employee resource group? Are you calling people from the community to do some panel discussion? But it's not about that. It's just the whole tick box saying that, I've done the inclusivity part of it for the year. Now I'm done and dusted. So this is what I felt in a month. What I have to tell about my journey is that my journey was not privileged. I didn't have performances given to me in a platter. I had to struggle. I had to work hard for it. So for me, initially, when I started performing, I had to literally go to each club and ask for a performance gig. And most of them have shut doors on me. I come there to say story. I come to say a story, and that's it. Ultimately, it's because of Mr. Keshu's story and the Lalit group of hotels that I was able to get a platform. If I was not able to get that platform, I still would be struggling. And that is something which even a lot of drag queens and drag kings are still struggling till date. So what we did when lockdown happened was that we started doing online shows, start creating, collaborating with each other, trying to do videos with each other, so that we can be like, hey, we are still surviving, we're still thriving. And that is the message that we were giving out during the lockdown and during this whole month.
That's really interesting. And I think that what you spoke about online hate, right? I think that's been something, especially when queerness goes outside cookie cutter frameworks of like gay men being on a poster saying gay marriage is okay, inviting a lot of hatred. I actually want to pivot back to Linz and say, Linz, you've been at the receiving end of some of that, about why kids should not be taught about what queerness is. And you've got a lot of comments in your YouTube videos being like, this is not for kids, like this is, like do it for adults, etc., etc. How do you deal with this online hate, and how have you processed that?
It's an ongoing process. The harassment, the hate, the online stuff, it sucks. And it's been going on. I think it like peaked in like 2016 during the Trump election, and it's still something that's pretty prevalent. I think a lot of the social media platforms have at least like gotten better at like helping like me like not see all of it, but it's still all there. So for me personally, it's been when I first started getting a lot of that harassment, I had a really good therapist. That was very important. And just kind of like recalibrating and looking at like how I was going about my activism and my work, and deciding to kind of prioritize my mental health and my self-care in a way that would aid the work that I was doing, because I found that I was burning out. Like I wasn't able to kind of like grow the thicker skin that I needed to move forward in my work. And I think like taking a little bit of a step back, making sure I was prioritizing, that I was like giving myself a day off when I needed one, that I was also putting effort into my work-life balance. So a lot of these just kind of different ways of figuring out how to take care of myself, so that when I kind of like go into the fray and do the work, I am in a mentally better space and I can be there more fully. And I'm not kind of like operating from this kind of place of scarcity, I think is the way that I like to talk about it, of like making sure that I can, especially when I'm in front of kids, because I do a lot of live performances, mostly over the internet now, but and a lot of the work that I do really is trying to cultivate and spread joy, this kind of like idea of queer joy, and putting that out into the world. And that takes a lot of energy. And I'm a performer, I sing, I tell stories, and I'm in front of kids and I'm in front of parents, and I have to be able to put my best face forward, and not kind of let that other noise bother me. And it takes work. It takes like active work to make sure that I can be present in those moments. And it's all about self-care. It's all about mental health, and making sure that you're stepping back and prioritizing yourself in those ways.
I want to quickly switch to Rachel in this conversation and say, I think, how do you tackle hate both online, digitally, and offline? And you've worked in some settings that aren't exactly the most friendly on either queer issues or race issues. You worked with European politics. Politics is itself a very sort of heteropatriarchal, often male-dominated space. So how has it been navigating those spaces, navigating that hate? What does self-care look like in those spaces for you? And how have you managed to counter it?
I don't know. I think I'm still managing. I'm not sure if I am. It's really hard. Like it really is hard, because I think it very much depends on your person. It depends on just trying to find the thing that works for you is already, it's so energy consuming. But when you have to tell yourself that you need a break, then you should just take a break. Then you just need to stop. You need to listen to the cues. You just need to learn to listen to yourself and listen to your body, which isn't always easy. I worked at the European Parliament before, and that was extremely hard. Just because one, at the European Parliament, there's over like 5,000 people that work in a particular building, and of the 5,000 people, and I was there for like nearly 5 years, I think I might have seen maybe 5 to 6 people of color who were working as an advocacy or an advisor, so a quite senior level. So it's extremely hard, knowing that you're completely surrounded by whiteness, and people, just continuously asking themselves, why are you there? You're getting the stares, you're getting the looks. People would come to my office and just knock on the door. My name's on the door, my name's on the desk, and they'd still come in and look at me and say, where's Rachael Moore? Because I have a name that, people don't really know. I know that like my name doesn't suit my face a lot of the time. So for when I be at meetings, people would just be extremely shocked to see me there, and it's in the glances, and it's things that you can just pick up on, and you can see it straight away. But dealing with the stress of that, I think Black people and people of color have to have a thick skin from day one. I don't think we're given the choice to not have a thick skin, because it is just really hard. It is continuous. It's every day. Even everything that we normalize about racism, we take it with us everywhere. So, before I get ready during the day, I already know, I tell myself basically, I'm going to get it today, either for being a woman or for being a Black woman or for being a bisexual woman. As soon as my partner shows up, they're going to see that I'm in a same-sex relationship. So I'm not on the lookout for it, but I know it's more often than not, it's going to happen. So for me, I try and practice radical honesty. So just being extremely honest with myself and saying, you've reached your limit, you need to stop here. I get death threats. I get really horrible mail from in and outside of the LGBTI community. I am the first Black woman who's the head of this organization. So people just look at me as a trash bin. They just basically send really hateful mails, especially when I'm speaking out about racism, because then they tell me that I'm, creating the division within the LGBTI community. Well, I'm like, well, where was the unity? I just answer, so where was the unity when a Black sex worker who is trans got murdered in Brussels? Where was the unity then? Were you helping then? A lot of the time when we think about racism, we don't think about the actual victims. We always think about the perpetrators, and that is for me one of the main concerns with how we approach racism, is that I don't know where to go as a victim of racism. I don't know who I can speak to a lot of the time. Well, now I do, because I created another organization for that. But people who are continuous victims of racism, whether it's normalized or not, they're dealing with a lot, and they have nowhere to go, and they have a lot of the time no one to speak to, no actual professional workers that can help them with this. And so finding what works for me took a long time, and I want to make sure that that period is shorter for everybody else, be they in the LGBTI community or outside of it. I want to make sure that people can get access to the services that they need a lot quicker than it took myself to do. So yeah, it was hard. It was hard, but I'm still here.
Yeah. No, and I think those are really important things to take care of, especially when we're surrounded in spaces that aren't conducive to our identities. And I want to use this moment to go to Leah and to ask about what your experience has been like, because you've been with the Miss America organization, the first non-binary person to hold a position in Miss America. That is, I mean, a very, very different organization, right? And I think it's literally breaking barriers and finding a space in contested territory. And how has that journey been? What has that journey been like, actually?
It's been really beautiful. I always say, not only am I a non-binary person in the Miss America organization, I'm a fat, queer, tattooed victim of sexual violence. My nude pictures were posted online when I was 14, and they just got taken down 2 years ago. And the Miss America organization still allowed me to have a title. And so I think that that's a beautiful, groundbreaking thing. It's obviously not just holding those, being, having that opportunity, it's what you do with it. And so I think that that's really important. But I will also say that being these things, having this body, existing in this space has been challenging. So I started competing in pageants in the Miss America organization when I was 14. And I only competed for 1 year, because after that, my nude pictures were posted online, and I felt like I could no longer exist in that space because I felt too much shame. So I hid in silence for almost 5-6 years without telling anyone what was going on with me. I've returned to the Miss America organization now as a 23-year-old person because I want to advocate on behalf of my younger self who didn't have a voice. I don't look like her, and I use she, her pronouns to refer to my younger self because I feel like we're almost two different people, but not all non-binary people do that. I totally believe that she had no voice and now I am her voice. And even though I am 100 pounds heavier than the average Miss America contestant, even though I look absolutely nothing like the average Miss America contestant, I think it's critical that I'm in this organization to break the barriers. And so not only am I in this organization to identify this way and to, you know, break glass ceilings or whatever, I'm actually trying to do the work. So every person in the Miss America organization has to have a social impact. And I have two. And the first is safety, which stands for security, accessibility, freedom, and equity for transgender youth. It's a program that I created to go into schools across the state of Connecticut and hopefully nationwide if I am to win the title of Miss Connecticut in June of next year. And basically ensure that they're implementing restorative justice procedures to make sure that all trans youth and non-binary youth in schools are being accurately and adequately represented by the curriculum in those schools, and to ensure that every school has, you know, a sexual orientation and gender identity office, a diversity office, whether that's K through 12 or a collegiate level, to ensure that they are represented in their institution. My other social impact is called Cyber Civil Rights for Americans Online, and it ensures that all individuals, regardless of age, gender, sexual orientation, race, whatever your identity is aware of your cyber rights as an individual who exists on the internet. My cyber rights were stripped from me when my nude pictures were posted online as a young child. My images were trafficked, my body was stolen from me, and I was basically seen as a sex object by millions of people on the internet, on this international image board where my images were hosted. And so I now want to educate young folks about how to properly use the internet in a safe and accessible way that does not, that is not detrimental to the health, wellness, and safety of anyone else. You know, this happened to me when I was a young person, and had I known about the resources that were available to me, had I had someone like myself as an advocate, I wouldn't have stayed silent for so long. I wouldn't have left the Miss America organization to begin with. And the last thing that I want to touch on is that I know that there's lots of stigma around the Miss America organization. I know there's lots of stigma around pageantry in general, specifically around, you know, swimsuits and how we judge people based on the way they look. Fortunately, Miss America in the last 2 years has taken away all aspects of judging that has to do with your body. And I truly believe that had that not happened, I wouldn't be where I am today. Because, you know, I am a fat person. I have stretch marks on my stomach. I am over 200 pounds, and my BMI, if we actually use the body mass index to calculate, you know, health now, is obese. And so as an obese, quote unquote, person, as a person of queer experience, as a non-binary person who also is femme, I think it's so important that we show that this organization, which has been historically created to uplift women, can now uplift other gender minorities who haven't had the same opportunities and who have had inaccess to justice. So I think that that's really important. And this organization gives scholarship and opportunity to people across the country. And I think it's a really beautiful thing. And so I don't think that it should be as stigmatized as it is. And I think that having people like me and hopefully others who will come into the organization after seeing me be allowed as a non-binary person, I think it'll open the doors for so many people to be accepted on a platform that has traditionally not accepted people historically based on their identity. So I think it's great. And I'm really proud and happy and grateful to be able to be that source of representation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's actually an incredibly powerful story, and I'm glad that you shared it with us. And I think it touches upon something so beautiful, which is that as queer and trans people, we are so invested in the idea of creating a better world for our younger selves, and sort of committed to change from a space that comes not so much just from, you know, that we want to do something, but we want to leave something behind so that others don't have to go through what we've gone through. And I think that's such an important thing that you've been able to work on. But I think it's beautiful that we create things that others can benefit from. And that's such a universal part of the queer and trans experience. I want to finally end this segment on online hate with going to Alex, because Alex, you were part of something very interesting, and at a time when we're still very, very far away from getting sex ed that is queer formative in schools in India, you tackled hate online. Interestingly, there was this video that came about which mocked femme people and showed boys putting lipstick on and then having hideous makeup looks on that was meant to target queer people and had a lot of queerphobic, transphobic, homophobic slurs. And you just took that and turned that around. So I'm sure that I'm going to send a link to everyone about what you did. But you got a bunch of drag queens together and said, we're going to counter this online on a level playing field. So tell me how that process has been and a little bit about how you've been able to do that through drag as well.
So in the beginning, everybody started targeting me in little ways through online, crawling into my DMs, saying, you're not good for nothing, you're overrated, you're that, you are too femme, all of those. Like most of these conversations or most of these hate messages which is coming from were from people who were really into toxic masculinity. They felt masculinity is the pro thing. You know what? We have to counter this. This was not spearheaded by me. I was really, wallowing in my misery because of lockdown and with all my gigs gone into the drain, all of that. So there were other two drag queens who are known as Whacker Cracker and Gentleman Gaga, who actually took an initiative and said, let's do it. Let's make sure that all these Indian brown drag queens are together and we're going to embrace our femininity. And towards the end, when I'm out of the misery, I just jumped in and I was like, okay, cool, I'm part of this. I want to help you girls. So if you go to my Facebook page and to the video, you will still see hate comments. I still have people varying from different sexualities to straight men, to straight women, actually saying stuff, very horrid things. Like, we have been also getting direct threats in different ways or the other. Go and kill yourself. Why are you alive? All of those kind of questions, all of those kinds of statements keep popping up. Most recently, I think until like a day before yesterday, I came across a lot of statuses which were very Islamophobic, and also at the same time, people from being Muslims, they actually are saying it's a haram. It's a haram to be gay. It's haram to be queer. But I am a Christian, so I know the Bible, and I know that Muslim was stemmed out, like we were come from the same family. So I know for the fact that God is only about that you need to love yourself and you need to love others as yourself. And that's all it matters. So for people to say this is haram, it's actually judgment. And I actually don't listen to such judgments. Like, I am here for a reason. I mean, if God really hated me, then why did he create me in the first place? This is the line that I used to my parents. I was like, if you think I'm a sinner or my sexuality is a sin, then why did God create me? Like, I am here, so you have to deal with me. There is no other choice. You have to deal with me. So this is how I take online hate in whatever form it comes back.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. And now we are coming towards the end of this incredible podcast. It's been such an honor chatting with all of you, with Leah, Lindsay, Rachel, and Alex. You've been incredible people to have on board. And I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to moderate this incredible podcast. I wanted to end on a note of hope. I wanted to share, the past few years have been strange, to say the least. I came back home to run a political campaign as an out gay man. I was all across the country traveling with the heteropatriarchy in Indian politics. And there was a time then, right, which felt like nothing is going to change. It did feel like, I'm out here, you've taken this gamble, you've come back, and you don't really see what you're hoping to see. Some of that changed. But today we're seeing a whole level of challenges that, personally, from the pinkwashing of things like Kashmir where you've gotten political organizations and political parties using queer rights to justify Islamophobia. And this happened when a Canadian parliamentarian said, we want to save Iranian queers, and that's why we should invade Iran. This happened after Orlando in the US, when a lot of people from the LGBTQIA+ community also used the shooting as a way to spread hate. And I have frozen, but I am back now. And I think it's a moment that's been disheartening, but it's also been incredible to see so many people stand up, and especially so many young people take up cudgels and say that this is not the future we want for ourselves. And we're seeing so many different movements speaking to each other. We're seeing sort of climate justice movements speaking to queer movements. We're seeing racial justice movements speaking to queer movements. We're seeing differently able rights movements speaking to queer people. And I want to know, what is the ray of hope that you are seeing in your personal journeys right now? And what is the message of hope that you feel inspired by that's going to help us get through this pandemic? God knows when it's going to end. And through what is going to be a roller coaster journey as queer people today. And I want anybody who wants to hop in first to hop in. I don't want any pressure for you to feel like you're on the spot for this. Go ahead, Rachel. Putting you on the spot.
I knew as soon as I did this, I was going to be the one. My ray of hope, actually, because even at the beginning of this pandemic, I already had hope. For me, I think the LGBTI community knows what a pandemic is. We've had pandemics before, and we know how to deal with them. So I don't think that for us, it was. From history shows us that we can survive this. So we were going to be okay. Of course, we need to take care of the ones that are most at risk, the ones that are immunocompromised, the ones that have already health issues. So those people we need to take care of within our community. But I think, if anything, history has taught us is that we can survive, and we will survive. So for me, after this pandemic, during this pandemic, I know that we're going to be okay. My ray of hope is that, I don't know, I think now, I think, if anything, not only COVID, but other things that have happened, the death of George Floyd, these are things that have gotten a lot of things moving and have shown us that if need must, we have to, combine forces and be the change and just implement change. We have to stop talking about it and now move over to action. For me, action is extremely important. So my ray of hope is my ray of hope is basically now that people are willing to actively listen and actively put the work and the effort in, and the actions. That for me is giving me much hope. I mean, I'm also a realist, so to a certain extent I really do hope that I prove the realist part of myself and the pessimists wrong, and that we keep the conversation going, and that we continuously ask ourselves questions, be critical, or be open to receiving criticism, and just be open to living a different version of life of what we knew before. That we don't have to be as productive as we thought we did. That we can lead to more lean more towards anti-capitalistic way of life, and that is just not heteronormative. That everybody can just live their truest self. So I'm hopeful for that. And from what I'm seeing, I think we have the momentum, and we have this particular moment right now to actually just carve out a world that we want to live in. So there we go.
Who wants to go next?
I can hop in.
Go ahead.
So I think that, looking back like 4 or 5 years ago, I think that there's just been a tremendous amount of change, and particularly in like kind of looking at the entertainment industry from the lens that I'm coming from. I mean, there's been so much that's the progress that's been made in the last like couple of years. I mean, when I started my work in queer kid stuff, there was, I think, maybe one person doing any of that work on the internet. And I think that, and now like the past weekend, I put on an event that was full of queer entertainers in children's media, and we filled up a whole hour of performances. It was incredible, and that event in itself would not have existed 4 or 5 years ago. And then you look at stuff like the Disclosure documentary that came out about trans representation in media, which was truly incredible. And I think that, you know, the entertainment industry is in turmoil right now. It's really being broken apart because of COVID, and you know, you can't go onto sets and have hundreds of people working on a show in close proximity. We can't do that. Theater is not a thing that exists anymore, and probably won't exist in the way it will kind of moving forward. It has to change, and I think that COVID is forcing the entertainment industry into a reckoning. And I think that allows us to rewrite a lot of the rules. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for change moving forward. And I think, you know, particularly from children's media, there's just so much rampant homophobia and transphobia around the experience of kids, and around, you know, this idea of like this innocent child and keeping them innocent and protected. When, you know, when you say let kids be kids, you're not talking about queer kids, you're not talking about Black kids, you're not talking about brown kids. You're not, you know, I see all these videos of young Black kids, especially young Black girls, who are, you know, taking the microphone, and they're like, what, 5 to 10 years old, and people are praising those kids, and it's like, no, that is not what they should be doing. They should be in school, they should be playing, they should have, you know, bedtime stories being read to them. They should not be out at protests. And you know, they can't do that like all the other white kids, because it's not a world that's built for them. Their lives are in danger every moment that they step out of their house, and they have to protest that just like grown-ups. And that is not a pressure that we should be put on kids. And I think that our media needs to reflect that, because there's so much widespread just like ripple effect that comes out of the entertainment industry and the stories that we choose to reflect. And I think that it's super, super important that we're kind of taking things apart and taking the time to deconstruct a little bit, and also taking the time to lift up marginalized writers. I think that that's something that's in behind the camera. So the people who are allowed to tell those stories, I think that something I've been seeing kind of in like the writer pipeline community is a lot more marginalized voices coming up and starting to be able to tell stories. Lots more executives who are specifically looking for Black storytellers, and I think, and queer storytellers in these spaces, and allowing us to tell and write our own stories. And yeah, that's kind of the ray of hope. And I think that like this is the kind of thing that we're not going to see results for in even like the next year. This is going to have ramifications for, you know, 3, 5, 10 years down the line. And that's kind of like the ray of hope that I'm like reaching for all the way out there, and like hoping that it pays off in that way. It's a long game. It really is. I think the work that I do is really thinking about a long game of like, okay, we can't necessarily change the world we're in right now immediately, but you know, how do we give young people the power to bring about the world that we wish we had? And you know, I think a lot of my work is about creating what I wish I had when I was a kid. And I think, Lee, what you said to, you know, talking to your, you know, 14-year-old self, I think I make the work that I do because I wish that, you know, 5, 10-year-old me had a queer person to look to in my mainstream children's media and in mainstream media generally. And I think it makes a world of difference. And I've already seen that kind of in the live performances that I do in kind of direct action with young people and families. And it's, yeah, that's whenever I see like a face dancing along to when I'm like playing Born This Way on my ukulele, it's that's what gives me hope is the young folks.
Thank you so much for that, Linz. That's so beautiful. And we're going to have Alex jumping in. Alex, your hand was up for a while earlier as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to say, like, since I came out to the point where a lot of people said that, the repealing of Section 377 is never going to happen, or it might take more than 50 years for it to happen. But for it to happen at 2018 was a really an overwhelming time for me, because I was like, it has been a struggle for our community, Indian LGBT community, literally, because we were branded as criminals, and we didn't want to be branded as criminals because we just love to express ourselves the way we are, sexually and in bodily expression. uh, like, what I see in terms of ray of hope is that I see, Bollywood representation growing more in terms of favor of the LGBT community, uh, more in terms of saying that, hey, we listen to you, we hear you out, all of that. And then in terms of, I see a lot of people from the community joining politics, which is a plus thing. We need representation in politics, especially during the time when there was anti-CAA rights, especially in Bangalore. Like, I'm going to take examples from Bangalore. It was spearheaded by the lesbians, actually. Like, no, none of the gay men took the charge or anything like that. It was the lesbians who took the charge. So you can imagine how the movement, our LGBT movement, is so intertwined. Like how you say about intersectionality. Like, we have so many movements which is intertwined together. So for us, we were voicing it out. What I see a ray of hope is that, whenever there is some sort of feel good campaign which is full of tokenism, there is a community ready to voice out and say, you know what, that is bullshit. We are not going to take that shit anymore. So for me, this is the ray of hope, that we all are standing together in some form or the other. It does not have to be in a defined manner, but we are doing it, we are voicing it out. And that is really important, because ultimately, like, if you go back to the history, our community started off as a protest. So whatever shit that we see outside, we are definitely going to call them out, and we're going to protest against what they're saying. So this is the ray of hope for me. Ultimately, also for me personally, it was when I started performing as a drag queen, I didn't have safe spaces as a drag queen. So I knew if I didn't have a safe space as a drag queen, a lot of people won't have safe space as well. So coming to a point that we have safe spaces in India right now, it is growing. It's not big, but it is growing, and I see how the momentum is happening. It's amazing, and that is great, and I'm so happy that that's happening. So these are the small ray of hopes that I have, but I know ultimately it's going to be shining, and that is what it matters. So, yeah.
On that very powerful, incredible note, Leah, do you want to end with your ray of hope?
Sure. So we live in the United States. I live under a government that is fundamentally oppressive to queer, trans folks, that is Islamophobic, xenophobic, transphobic, biphobic, homophobic, just all the phobics it is. The Trump administration is fundamentally dangerous to the plight of all marginalized people in the United States. If you are not white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, able-bodied, you are not protected under the Trump administration, and it is fundamentally dangerous. However, ray of hope is that I still feel that things are moving in the right direction, and we have checks and balances in the United States. The Supreme Court released 3 decisions recently, which are, I think, incredible. In our conservative court, Justice John Roberts and even conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch cited on behalf of abortion providers, dreamers, and LGBTQ plus employees in employee protection cases this month. So that was a fundamental ray of hope for me, that we have checks and balances in the Supreme Court, and we have checks and balances in the legislative branch to make sure that the executive branch isn't obtaining too much power, even though they still are. So that was a ray of hope. Another thing that happened this week was that Mississippi voted to remove the Confederate flag from their state flag, which I think was an incredible moment. But at the same time, and we have our elections in November to vote out this oppressive government and to hopefully vote in someone who isn't perfect by any means, but is fundamentally better than the administration of Donald Trump. I think that that's a ray of hope. However, while we're waiting, in the months that it takes to get to November, trans folks are still being murdered. Black women are still being, are dying in childbirth, and who are, having inadequate and unjust healthcare practices against them. Breonna Taylor's killers are still at large. We need to stand up. And so the ray of hope for that is the Black Lives Matter movement. People taking to the streets with Breonna Taylor's name on a sign, with Nina Pop's name on a sign, with Tony McDade's name on a sign, saying, "We will not forget you. We will fight for you." Trans people, Black folks, should not be murdered and martyred to matter. We need to make sure that people matter while they're alive, not just in death. And I think that more and more people are realizing that, and that's why we're taking to the streets. And so that is a ray of hope as well. So I think we have a lot to be hopeful for, and hopefully in November we vote out this oppressive administration, and we can vote in an administration that will fundamentally verify the rights of all those who have been whose rights have been stripped by the administration of Donald Trump. Hopefully it doesn't harm us. It hasn't in this past 4 years harmed us to the point of no return. Hopefully young folks who have grown up under the administration of Donald Trump and don't know any better can look up to their LGBTQ plus elders and know that, there is hope, and we are, we do deserve to be here. We do deserve to be alive. And so long as advocates and allies continue speaking out and continue taking to the streets and exercise their right to vote if they are able in November, I think that there is a lot to be hopeful for. And we shouldn't lose sight of that in spite of all that's going wrong.
Oh, wow. And with this, what an incredible end. I think we've heard of resilience, we've heard of resistance, we've heard of bridging solidarities and building new ones, and crafting global voices around queerness that allow us to not assume that our struggles are the same, but rather learn from and contribute to each other's path of liberation. Sending so much love, so much power to all of you. And let's hope that our little rays of hope become one big ray of sunshine that's going to sweep over, and we're going to forget all that happened this past month and long before that.